welcome everyone. It is Wednesday, October 16th, 2024, real close to Election Day, or as our friend Sean Haney would say, Independence Day. And welcome to our microphones, my former boss and Washington Times editor-at-large, David Keene. Welcome, and our host is back from his tour of Constantinople. Welcome back, Mark and Jackie Saxton. Take it away, guys.
Thank you, Dwight. Welcome back, Mark and David. Welcome. Thank you for joining us. It's been nothing if not an eventful election cycle. So we'll have a lot to talk about from the top down. Mark, since you're fresh off your vacation, I'll let you pick where we start.
Well, I was very interested in it. Of course, one of the things we referenced, obviously, in your title, the Washington Times editor-at-large, but you did a very interesting piece, again, for somebody who's a well thought of movement conservative, about the Larry Hogan race in Maryland and why you supported Larry. And I thought it'd be interesting for you to have the opportunity to elaborate on your thinking about that.
Well, Larry, who's a nice enough fellow and I've known for a long time, is not my cup of tea when it comes to the positions he's taken. Although, as somebody pointed out, he's running in a socialist state, and that he had to trim his sails somewhat. But the fact is that if, as a senator, he won't vote as a solid conservative. That's not what he is. He's a pragmatist. But as I told somebody who complained that I supported him in this race, I said, "Do you know what's at stake this year in the United States Senate? If the Republicans lose the presidency, which they may or may not do, they're likely to lose the House. And if they lose the Senate, that means to have a unitary government in the hands of people that want to end the filibuster, rewrite the First and Second Amendments, and end any semblance of privacy and free speech in the country." As I said, all Larry Hogan has to do is get elected and stand with the Republicans, because anybody that gives the Republicans a majority in the United States Senate, or could give the majority, is worth supporting this time. If he does that, he can vote any way he wants from that point on, because he'll have done what we need him to do. I think, though, that I think it's unlikely, or at least a tough road for him to go down, because he's got to get about a third of the Democrats in Maryland in order to win that race. And unfortunately for us, they know what's at stake as well as we do. And so they're running against Donald Trump, and it's going to be hard in Maryland for Hogan to overcome that.
Well, and it's frustrating to me if you dig into the Democrats' reasoning for people who don't want to vote for him. If you look at the polling that's come out, limited as it is, you have Democrats saying, "I don't know who Angela Alsobrooks is. I like Larry Hogan, but the only reason I'm not voting for him is because I don't want Republicans to have a Senate majority." And I would love to just shake these people and be like, the Republicans are going to have the Senate majority anyway. We're getting West Virginia. We're getting Montana. That's enough. You might as well vote for someone who you at least like better on the ticket, who, if you're very anti-Donald Trump, has said he will be an outspoken, counterpoint to Donald Trump on the Republican side. Or if you think the Republicans are too far to the right, might try to actually move them back towards the middle. That argument can be made if people are willing to listen.
Yeah, no, he's had a pretty good record as governor, particularly when you think about the fact that they've had supermajorities in both houses of the legislature during his two terms. Republicans in Maryland get elected to the governorship only when the other party completely screws things up. That's how Hogan got in. He was able to hold what was an outraged bunch, turn them into supporters of his, and win a second term, which is really unprecedented in modern times in Maryland. The previous governors, from Agnew to Ehrlich and the others, they were elected because the Democrats had messed it up so badly, or fielded candidates that just weren't electable. So Hogan's a good politician, and probably the only Republican that could have won the governorship in Maryland and held it. But this is a different race. It's a race that, as you say, is so there's so much at stake, and the Democrats know that as well as we do.
Well, I want to play a little bit of crystal ball with what you just said about the governorship, since we have that again in 2026. Is Wes Moore another O'Malley? I mean, he hasn't taxed the reign, but he certainly pilfered every last cent that Hogan left for him.
It's hard to imagine that anybody's another O'Malley. I mean, I think he's way to the left, but he's smarter than O'Malley was, so he'll be a harder one to knock off. But when these folks get their head and think they can do what they want to do, they tend to overreach as a group, and there's a reaction. That's what happened in Maryland. That's what's happening in the country right now.
You have a deep perspective on the conservative movement. You go back, obviously, we talked before about your leadership at CPAC. In the Trump era, how do you see the conservative movement moving forward? The party has changed, the movement has changed.
Well, both parties have changed, and that wasn't Trump that did that. Trump accelerated it in some ways. But it all began really in the 60s, and then accelerated during the McGovern years in the Democratic Party. In the late 60s with Nixon and the left, you had what the pollsters used to call peripheral urban ethnics, which meant Southern European Catholics, working people in mostly on the East Coast through the industrial states, who had been counted on as loyal Democrats from the Roosevelt era up to then, who found themselves uncomfortable with the new Democratic Party that was emerging in the 70s, and they began to move first as a dribble, and then as almost the floodgates opened, and they started to vote Republican. The problem that emerged was that while they continued to vote Republican, because the Democrats who they had left because they found them obnoxious became even more obnoxious as time went on. So they continued to vote Republican. But while Republicans across the country welcomed their votes, they didn't really want them or do much for them or really listen to them. So that by the time we got to the Trump election, you had these people, mostly former Democrats or from the families of former Democrats, who thought they had to vote Republican, but didn't think anybody paid much attention to them. And they thought Trump did pay attention to them, and they went to him. I'm part of the old conservative movement. My father spent his lifetime, most of his lifetime, as a union organizer, later ran a bar. And my mother was the 5-time president, and I don't even know if they have these anymore, but of the Women's Auxiliary of the United Auto Workers, which was a very liberal group. By the time Goldwater and Nixon came along, they were Republicans, and that's most of the people who made up the beginning of the conservative movement were former liberals, former Democrats, and in our case, former working people. We were in Wisconsin. And when you had the 2016 race, Wisconsin has a higher percentage of non-educated white working people than any Midwestern state. Remember, Wisconsin was a farming state, is a farming state, and a manufacturing state. It wasn't run by elites. It was those people. And those were the people that in 2016 said, we've had enough. What's shocking today to the Democrats is, if you'll remember when Obama was elected, there were these books and tracts and articles about how it was all over for the Republicans, because with the minority vote as it was being locked in as Democratic property, that the Republicans couldn't win again. I remember I was doing a piece about this whole panic among Democrats about the black vote may not be as solid as they once thought it was. If you remember some years ago, whenever there was a conservative or Republican gathering, somebody would write that it was shocking to them that there were no black faces in the crowd, or very few. Now they're really shocked when they see black faces in the crowd, because they think those folks have a genetic loyalty that they have to give, that their vote has to go to the Republicans. It never occurs to them that black people, like white people and tan people, are individuals who have their own views. If you notice the lecture that Barack Obama gave, because black men are not as unified behind Kamala Harris as he thinks they should be, that it's their fault, that they're sexist or something, because it's never occurred to any of these people that people might make up their own minds, and that when they do that, they might not agree with them on everything. And these folks think that anybody who disagrees with them on anything is doing so because they're somehow evil. So now black men are evil because they're misogynists, which they weren't before. And what they're discovering is that some of those, not all of those folks that they dislike are white. Some of them are black people who happen to agree with the precepts of conservatism in the Republican Party more than than with the Democrats. And what's happening among these minority groups now is what happened in the 60s with the peripheral urban ethnics. There's a dribble. And if history repeats itself, that dribble is going to grow and grow. And that's going to hurt the Democratic Party on election days, not just this year, but in the future. It wasn't Donald Trump himself that attracted that. It was beginning before he ran in 2016, but he certainly recognized it and has gone after non-traditional Republican voters, and as a result, he's getting them.
When I think he and Republicans as a whole realized that what Democrats have been doing all along is taking these voting blocks for granted.
Well, absolutely.
And Republicans have really been able to bring out that, hey, you're an individual. You don't have to agree with everything they say. And what you're talking about, the same thing with auto workers, right? We've seen this shift of Democrats becoming this white male elitist party, or in a lot of ways, a black female elitist party. And your blue collar workers are really starting to shift over to the Republican Party.
No, and as I say, both parties have changed. When I was growing up in the Midwest, if you wanted to get involved in Republican politics, you had to talk to the elites, the managerial class, the people that ran the factories and all. They're the people that dominated the Republican Party, the bankers. Remember, we used to call it the country club party. Then the Goldwater campaign came along, and all of a sudden, you didn't talk to the banker, you talked to the corner cleaner, because the small business people began to have a major role in the Republican Party. Meanwhile, the Democrats were driving away working people, and they began voting Republican. And if you listen to the leadership of the two parties, a lot of senior Republican leaders talk like they're still the representatives of big business and bankers, because that's what they were when they were. And if you listen to some of these senior Democrats, you'd think that they were all in favor of working people. The fact is, most of them don't want any working people anywhere near them or their children, unless they're cleaning the house or mowing the lawn. Have switched constituencies in many ways, and both of them are grappling with how do you deal with this. The Democrats have it easier because they become dominated by these highly educated financial elites, and they just do what they want, and that's what's hurting them with the general population. The Republicans have to figure out how do they take their traditional principles and relate to their new constituency, and they're grappling with that. This will sort itself out over time, but it's going to take time. And what you see in the Republican Party now is what you've seen many times before. When a party changes, when a club gets new members, the old guys don't like that because it means somebody might threaten them. Back in during the Nixon era, I worked for Vice President Agnew, and he was put in charge of what the President Nixon called Operation Switch. We were to try to go out and get Democrats officials, particularly in the South, to move over. And that became very difficult because in those states, the Republican Party was generally very small. It was made up of aspiring young attorneys and the like, country club types, who didn't want any more members because they were quite comfortable because they had this little club. And when there was a Republican president, we called them post office parties. They got to name the postmasters, which it still did in those times. They got to recommend people for U.S. attorney slots, and like they had a lot of power. And I remember then that the biggest roadblock to getting Democrats to switch were the Republicans that were already there, because they didn't want a bigger group. And if you go back through political history, even more recently, when Goldwater came along, the Republican establishment was appalled. He came from the Southwest. He wasn't like them. They pinned it on his ideological perspective. But that was only a part of it. It was more cultural. It was more who had the power. Then you'll remember when the evangelical voters started in the Pat Robertson era. And one of the national committeemen said, having them in your meeting is like going to the bar scene in Star Wars. And what happened in each case, in the Goldwater case, eventually they became the senior establishment. What usually happens here in the evangelicals, a third of them went back, some of them did, and a third of them stayed and got socialized into the party. And all of a sudden they were running things. Then came Reagan. And Reagan was just appalling to what was left of the Eastern establishment, because the man wore brown suits and he came from California and he didn't graduate from an Ivy League college. So how could he pretend to be a presidential caliber? It turned out that it wasn't his politics they disliked, it was him, and it was for cultural reasons. And I remember at the time I worked in Ronald Reagan's campaign against Jerry Ford in 1976, ran the South for him. And one of my best friends was a national committeeman from New Mexico. And the Reagan campaign was just going to run over all those people. And I said, there's nothing I can do. It's not my area. But they're going to kick you out. And he said, well, I understand that. He said, my question is, what took so long? He said, how do you think I got this job? I was a Goldwater guy. And I took it in 1964, and it took them this long for another generation to come along. So these kinds of things go on and will go on. And it's going on right now within the Republican Party as new people come to the fore. But that will, as it has in the past, work itself out. And it'll work itself out on a personal, cultural, and positions and policy levels. So I'm always an optimist, mainly because I've seen it before and we'll see it again.
It does seem, though, that the Democratic Party, with their sort of focus on, if the message is Trump is bad, it seems as though that their strategists, activists have been less attuned to the changes that have taken place and have been caught unaware, because, again, I guess, and we talked before, this expectation is that the demographics have been locked in forever and ever and shouldn't change.
Yeah, I mean, it's amazing that it took them, the fact that the Hispanic vote was changing, and that's for the same reason. I mean, for years, Republicans were told that Mexican Americans and other Hispanics should be more inclined to the Republican Party because of their culture and religion and work ethic and all of this. That attracted none of them. It wasn't until Joe Biden and the progressives came along that masses of Hispanic voters decided, oh, be with them anymore. And they started to move to the Republicans. And through this whole period, in the last election, and actually in 3 or 4 elections, there has been black voters, particularly younger voters, leaving the Democratic Party. Not in great numbers. This always starts as a dribble. But every one of those that leaves, in their minds, is 2 votes, because it means they lose one and the Republicans gain one. But they always assumed, as a matter of faith, that since they owned that voting bloc, they'd all come back on election day. And of course they did for Barack Obama, because it was the first black presidential candidate that we had, and that was their opportunity. Just as in 1960, all the Catholics virtually voted for Kennedy. It was the first Irish Catholic president. And Kennedy realized before his assassination that would work once. But after that was over, they're going to say, well, we did that. Now what are you doing for us? And that's what was happening after the Obama election. They voted that time in the old way because it got them symbolically something, and that's totally explainable. But after that, they began asking themselves, as they'd begun to ask before, what are we really getting out of this? Is this really a party that represents our interests? And most of the data that you look at now finds that a working black male has more in common with a working white male than he does with the elites that either run the Democratic Party or assume that they own him. But it took until the last few weeks, for the Democratic leadership and their candidates and their strategists to realize, oh my God, these people aren't going to march in lockstep the way we've always expected them to do. So instead of trying to think about why they aren't marching in lockstep, we'll send Barack Obama out to lecture them and try to shame him to voting for our candidate. And that's not working.
Well, in a lot of ways, this race and this candidate, Donald Trump, at the top of the ticket, are very unprecedented. You can't rely too much on historical precedents to figure out what's going to happen. So in terms of coattails, do you think that Donald Trump has coattails in a lot of these down ballot races, particularly the Senate races, congressional races, or not so much? I think we saw in 2020 a lot of his anointed picks kind of outran him, or in 2022 people who he endorsed underperformed. So I'm not really sure what's going to happen.
Well, it's interesting, and that's one of the interesting anomalies of this year's race. You can go to states where Trump is doing very well, and the Senate candidate's doing badly, or you can go to a state where Kamala Harris is ahead, but the Republican is doing well. They're more separated than they have been in recent years. It used to be that if you nationalize the race, that helps all the way across. And that's not so true this year, partly because of the nature of the candidates. Donald Trump is not everybody's cup of tea. And his personality attracts some people but drives other people away, and they may be Republicans or Democrats. But at the end of the day, the movement of voters, the changes in the electorate, the positioning of the parties on policies aren't going to be determined by one person. They're going to be Donald Trump is unique. Every presidential candidate is unique and brings strengths or not. Some of them don't do anything except lead their party, and they have a partisan breakdown. Some of them have a cross-party appeal, and some of them are polarizing. Modern elections, for good or for ill, are much more about mobilizing your base than going after other voters. You can still do it in down ballot races sometimes, as Hogan did when he was elected governor in Maryland. But I always use the example when Ronald Reagan ran in 1984. He won overwhelmingly over Walter Mondale, but the initial polls showed that the persuadable portion of the electorate, the middle portion, was 30%. That could have gone either way. That same question on polls taken when George Bush ran, that 30% was down to 8%. And both parties realized that we can't spend all of our time going after half of that 8%. What we need to do is find people that are with us and get them to the polls. And that's more and more what elections have become. And as I say, that's for good or ill. Nixon famously, and perhaps in a Nixon-esque way, said years ago that the way you win is you go to in the Republican Party, you go to the right for the nomination, then you move to the center for the general election. That was sound wisdom in 1960, '68. It doesn't work today. You have different kinds of campaigns, you have different technology, and you have different bases within the party. So you have to go about it differently, and they do.
I wondered, we may be belaboring the point we're making before, but what's fascinating to me is that 30, 40 years ago, we talked about union households. And it was a combination of both government workers who were unionized, but also private sector unions, the UAW, steel workers, say West Virginia, it would have been coal workers. It doesn't seem now that, with the exception of government workers, which are their own category, the notion of union households seems to have declined. And you look at, again, use West Virginia as an example. That was a state that
Yeah.
was a lock for Democratic elections. And I think now, it's certainly not, it's so Republican that I think their legislature that only flipped 10 years ago is now 3/4 Republican.
That's correct.
Is that, do you see that change of the breakdown of the sort of gravitational pull of the private sector, the industrial unions being
Well,
key?
in the old days, the Democratic Party was really controlled by organized labor. They didn't rely on volunteers. They relied on union volunteers who were sent out by the unions to walk the streets and the precincts for them. Republicans had a different thing. Back in the 1960s, probably the most important adjunct group of the Republicans were the Republican Women Federation, because they provided the volunteers that did the work that for the Democrats was done by the unions and done by union personnel. But even then, a lot of private sector unions in particular were not as solidly Democratic as one would have thought by listening to Lane Kirkland at the AFL-CIO or any of these people. As you know, I served a decade ago as president of the National Rifle Association. And the National Rifle Association's influence became because the Second Amendment issues are an issue that people will cross party lines on. They'll vote for a Republican they think is good, or against one that's bad, or for a Democrat they think is good. And the influence, the political influence of the NRA came about during that era in particular, because the people who would cross over on election day were working people in Michigan, in Wisconsin, in Ohio, in Pennsylvania, were hunters and gun enthusiasts who, if they felt their rights were being threatened by Democrats, would move over. They've now moved over for a whole lot of other reasons, and they're more reliably Republican. But today's unions are, with the exception of public employee unions, and only some of them, the membership it's the reason the Teamsters wouldn't endorse. I mean, they don't need a revolt from their membership. It's the reason the police unions wouldn't endorse Kamala Harris, because they don't need a revolt from their members either. They represent, and the union leadership, like the party leadership, is living in an old world. They're living in a world where they represented a Democratic constituency. Now they don't, and they're still acting as if they do, but they've got one eye on reality, and they know they have to pull back to the extent that they can. So the union household is now just like every other household, and votes like every other household. So you got to go after them if you're a politician, based on their interests, not on their union boss's interests.
Right. So I guess shifting back to Maryland for a bit, you talked about how you think it definitely is an uphill battle for Hogan. I've been hearing a lot of people, I mean, you have a lot of your Republicans saying, oh, I can't vote for that rhino or whatever. But it sounds to me, at least from what I'm hearing on the ground and from people I've been talking to, that they're going to hold their noses and vote for him.
I think because they may complain about it.
Yep.
And I understand that, but they also know what's at stake. And if they can, by electing him, they get to 51, 52, or even 53 senators. That's the single most important thing that they can do this year, and they know that. I mean, the politicians, in my experience over the years, um, assume that voters are not as smart as voters are. And the fact is that voters see these things. You'll remember back in the, well, you won't because you're too young, but back in the late 60s, a fellow by the name of Joe McGinnis wrote a book about the selling of the president. It was all going to be done by television and all that. That's never worked. I mean, what happens is that people take presidential races very, very seriously. They don't. When you vote for a congressman, congresswoman, you're voting for somebody to handle your Social Security problems, do the casework that's necessary. Senate races become very, very ideological because a senator doesn't do a damn thing except vote and give speeches. But when you go in to vote for president, whoever you are, this is somebody who's going to have to be able to deal with something we can't even imagine. It could be life and death. It could be the economy. It could be all these things, and they tend to take that vote seriously, and they judge their candidates. Even seeing them on TV, listening to the speeches and all that, it gets out there and it gets through, and ultimately, at the end of the day, issues matter, and political strategists often don't think they do. But one of the problems that Ms. Harris is having is that she has no positions. And that's become clear to voters, and that scares them. They know what Donald Trump is. They may like him or dislike him. They lived through 4 years of him. And while it may have been a noisier 4 years than they wished that it were, the country came out of it in pretty good shape. So he's at least a known quantity. And when it comes down to a presidential vote, a known quantity can oftentimes beat a vague quantity because people do care about these things.
So let's play out two hypothetical scenarios. One, I mean, I think we can agree that we're going to take the Senate. That's not a question. But
well, I will say this: if you and I were betting $1, I'd agree with you.
Yeah.
If you were asking me to mortgage my house and bet the Republicans would take the Senate, I would not make that bet because there are so many races that are so close. The one that's caught everybody's attention now is Deb Fischer's race in Nebraska, where she was locked in, and now she's tied with an independent because there's a public feeling out there. If she were running against Democrats, she'd still be locked in, I think. But there's feeling out there, we don't like any of you. And here's somebody that doesn't have one of your labels, we'll go for him. I mean, there are so many races that are so close. I think that they're going to tip in enough so that the Republicans will have control of the Senate, but don't bet on it.
Okay, so now you've added a third hypothetical we could talk about later, which is if Hogan had run as an independent, but we'll get back to that.
I don't think that would have worked either.
Would that have helped him, right? Because I've seen Democrats saying, if you decide to run as an independent, I would have voted for you. But anyway, okay, so let's say that we do take the Senate. With Trump in the White House versus with Harris in the White House, I want to think about the Supreme Court, because I know that there is someone, I think it's Justice Sotomayor on the Supreme Court, that the Dems have been trying to get out so we can get someone else in before we potentially lose the White House and the Senate. What do you see playing out with the Supreme Court over the next 4 years, depending on who wins?
If the Democrats win the White House and hold the Senate, they will expand the court. And they've all signed on to that now. When it was first talked about, and some raised the concern that they might do this, everybody poo-pooed the idea and said they'll never do that. Now everybody signed on, all Democratic leadership. They view the Supreme Court the way you'll recall Hillary Clinton viewed it in her debate in 2016 with Trump as sort of a legislature. And so it's not something that you have to treat with any kind of sanctity or appreciation that it's a co-equal part of the government. You want to make sure it votes your way, and they're dedicated to doing that. If they're elected and control the Senate and the presidency, they'll get rid of the filibuster. and they'll pack the Supreme Court. I have no doubt whatever about that. And once something like that happens, then the Republicans will come back, and they'll say, well, we need 2 more justices in order to get it back our way. I remember I was having dinner when Harry Reid was the Senate leader, and he decided to nuke the filibuster for appointees. And I was having dinner the night that all this was going on with Lamar Alexander, the then senator from Tennessee. And he'd been sort of in the middle. He said he felt like the kid in the classroom when the other kids wouldn't talk to each other. They'd pass notes between. And he finally said to Reid, he said, okay, go ahead, do this. And if you do it, in 2 years or whenever, the Republicans will take over the Senate, and then you're not going to believe what's going to happen. And that's exactly what happened. So when you start getting rid of the filibuster, doing these things, changing it, it always comes back to bite you, which should tell you that it was not a good idea in the first place. But they'll do it, and then we'll have a more democratic system of government that will not respect the rights of the minority, that will not respect free speech, will not respect the other aspects of the Constitution.
So on the flip
side, very dangerous. I think if it's why I consider the Senate so important, because the likelihood is that the country will be saved by the Senate if she wins the presidency, because the Democrats are likely to regain control of the House. But if you got the Senate, then reason has to prevail, because one side can't run roughshod over the other.
So on the flip side, if the Republicans take the Senate and the White House, do you think that we're going to go from a 6-3 majority to 7-2? Are the Democrats going to lose any of their Supreme Court justices in 4 years, or are any of ours going to step down? What do you anticipate happening there?
There might be a couple. I think the likelihood is that the early retirees would be conservative justices, and so it wouldn't necessarily change the balance on the court very much. Now, this whole effort by the Democrats to get Sotomayor to step down. She's not sick. They just wanted to appoint somebody else that was younger, just in case they didn't win. I like to tell the story of years ago. The New York bar bribes its judges by having this fancy program in the Virgin Islands, and they pick a judge to pick the participants, so he gets to take care of all of his buddies. And a federal judge up there, who was a good friend of mine, and we'd worked together on a number of Supreme Court cases, named Ralph Winter, had it 1 year, and he had years before clerked for Justice Marshall, Thurgood Marshall. This was 5 years before Marshall left the court, and everybody got to take a guest and go down and stay in this fancy place and be on panels. And I took my then 12 or 13-year-old daughter, and we ate at tables like we do a round table with 8 people. And as luck would have it, she's assigned to sit next to Justice Marshall. And he was a very nice fellow. But of course, by that point, the Democrats were keeping him on the court waiting for a Democrat to be able to replace him. And he was he watched cartoons during the day, and his wife led him around. And he made Joe Biden look to be in good shape. And I remember that first night, we were walking back to our cabana, and my daughter said to me, "Dad, what does Mr. Marshall do?" And I said, "He's a member of the United States Supreme Court." And she looked at me and she said, "Oh my God." Well, if you're a Republican or a Democrat, you try to keep your people on and replace them when another when they can be replaced by somebody like them. And finally, Marshall Moore said, "No, I'm not, it's time to go." But that's happened before, of course.
There has been some talk. There's an effort to keep 9 to create a constitutional amendment to keep
Right.
the Supreme
I think that's a great idea.
9.
I'm shocked that the Republicans didn't pick up on it, because the polling shows that the public gets it.
Right.
The public thinks. I mean, even Ruth Bader Ginsburg said 9 seems to me to be a nice number. And it's at the beginning, the Republicans didn't think it would be an issue. And the court usually isn't. It was an issue in 2016 because of Hillary Clinton's remarks about what she wanted to do with the court. And I think it's an issue now. And it is not an issue that if the public really knows what the Democrats want to do with the court, it's not an issue that works to their advantage. But the Republicans did not and have not taken advantage of it. It hasn't been raised really in many speeches at all. I think it is an issue that has a great deal of salience with the public.
And Mike Lee wrote a whole book about it, his Keep 9 book.
And it'd be a good idea.
Sounds like a great constitutional amendment to me. But
yeah, no, it's the history of it is that the court's been changed up and down several times. Lincoln used it to try and get people on his side when he needed them, kept it open and enlarged it. And then Roosevelt failed. It's generally said that he failed when he tried to pack the court. Actually, he didn't fail. He didn't pack the court, but he changed the court because the court moved its voting to try and avoid the kind of threat that he made. So the fact that you can do that goes back to then. And when a few years ago, remember when Chuck Schumer didn't like it, he warned the court, bring up these cases and we can change you. And so the fact that power exists is a threat to the independence of the national judiciary that can be removed with a simple amendment.
So we're coming up on the end of the show. We like to give our guests an opportunity to plug anything that they have going on. We've had a lot of authors on the show, anything like that. So anything that you want to plug or talk about before we wrap up?
No, I do want to repeat what has been sort of underlying what we've been talking about this evening. In my 40 or 50 years in Washington, whenever an election comes along, somebody will get up and say, this is the most important election of your lifetime. What they really mean, it's the most important election of their lifetime because they're a candidate and their future depends on how you vote. This time, the sky really is falling. And this is conceivably the most important election that we've had in decades, and maybe in our lifetime. So it really is important for people to get out and vote, more important than it ever has been. There are folks who say, well, I don't like either of these parties. They're not perfect. The candidates aren't perfect. I don't like the way Donald Trump talks. I don't like the way that, all of these things. That's fine, but look at it. Every voter should look at the potential consequences of the other side, whatever their position is, winning. And they should get out there and vote. And I'm confident if that happens, that the country will be in good shape. But the country's only going to be in good shape if the public forces it in that direction.
And for our Marylanders watching, because it is a great, couldn't say it better myself, early voting in Maryland starts next Thursday, the 24th, and goes through the 31st. I highly encourage you to go and bank your vote, get it in there, because Maryland's got this new insane rule that if somebody votes in your name and you show up to vote and they said you already voted, they're going to take the first one anyway. So get it in early, get it over with. I go vote early every single election cycle that I can, and there's never a line. So I highly recommend it. You get a cool
as long as you don't vote often.
Right, exactly. We'll save that for the other side. I'm sure Mark will be manning the hotline again this year. So if you find someone voting often, call Mark. In terms of plugs, we're rapidly approaching the holiday season. The Young Republicans are having our Christmas Gala December 20th at the Links at Chaladon in Mount Airy. The Montgomery County Republican Club is having our Christmaka party. Dwight, correct me if I'm wrong, December 8th. Yep.
Yes, December 8th.
Awesome. And as always, we will be doing Toys for Tots collection. So make sure to bring an unwrapped gift with you. And I'm sure there'll be plenty more festivities going on. Hopefully some great inauguration festivities come January.
And it looks like you're going to elect a Republican congressman in Maryland.
Yeah.
Fingers crossed, Andy.
And
you're a safe friend.
And we got to get at the vote rally this Saturday in Frederick for Neil Parrott.
Yes.
Come on out and vote. Support Neil. It'll be a lot of fun.
So many ways to get involved right now. And if you're ever looking for events, Dwight does a really good job of updating our website. So you can see everything you need to see up there or on our Facebook. Yeah. And we will be back next week with a super awesome, another exciting guest.
And we'll see everyone at Missoni's in Baltimore.
Yes. If you never know where to find us, we're there eating pasta. I'll be eating my weight in carbs. Have a great night, everybody. We'll be back next week.
Thanks for having me.